built this country, that actually built this city to what it is. So it is so important for us to center our experiences and teach and learn from each other about our historical experiences and how we made the city that we're in. And today, how did our people make King Drew what it is, and how do we continue making it what we want it to be? Okay, so again, this is a part of our lecture series titled LA, an Ode to Our Black and Brown City. This is our third lecture, but we're going to review a little bit about our first and second one, just in case you want to remember some of the stuff that we've taught already. Lecture 1 was an introduction to our Black and Brown community, with our essential question being, why should we learn our Los Angeles history? We learn about the Tongva people, who are the indigenous people of this city, right? Of this location in Southern California, who are still here. We learn about people like Pio Pico. We learn about Biddy Mason, who are all Black indigenous people of color that founded Los Angeles. So the importance of creating that base to know that, so that we can build from that, and how that's been a legacy in Los Angeles and remembering our history.
The second one, our second lecture was all about location. So location, location, location. The essential questions for that one: why does everyone look like me in my neighborhood? And the second one: how long are people going to look like me in my neighborhood? So we focused really on Prop 13. That's going to be the property tax funding law that associates how much schools get based on how much property tax is in the area. But then we also talked about displacement. We talked about the housing covenants. We talked about redlining and gentrification. And for those of you all who don't know, redlining is when the government, the cities, the federal, local, and state governments, and private businesses were allowed to exclude African Americans, Latino Americans, and Asian Americans from owning property in certain parts of the city, which is why when you think about LA, most Black and brown people live in the same neighborhoods, because that's what traditionally and historically where they could live. So now here we are, Ms. Lopez.
Chapter 3, we are now with our essential question: how did we get to King Drew? Our title and our essential question: what is our role in preserving our communities? Again, in thinking and learning how it was community that made King Drew, literally built King Drew Magnet High School, and still continue to make it. And just a reminder, our lectures have been recorded. This one as well is being recorded. You can watch this at King Drew Vision YouTube channel, so you can go ahead and subscribe to it and watch the past lectures.
All right, so usually, unfortunately, whenever we have positives that happen in our community, it's usually sometimes the result of some negative things that have occurred. So we're going to talk about some rebellions and some riots that really shaped the city that we know today. And some of the causes of these riots are still happening today. We'll talk about that in a second, but we'll see how the struggle in 1965 is going to lead to the progress that we see today in 2021. So we have the Watts riots, or the Watts rebellions as they're known as well. And those are going to be from August 11th through August 16th of 1965. And they're going to start on 116th Street and Avalon Boulevard, which is not too far from King Drew, which is on 120th and Compton. So, Ms. Lopez, I see this term here, or this phrase, historical systems of oppression. What does that mean?
Right. First, I want to invite us to all take a deep breath. You know, we're waking up every other morning with news, right, of police brutality, of our community members being affected by a lot of these causes that we're going to talk about that have existed for many decades. Systems of oppression, right, include systems like racism, patriarchy, white supremacy. Right, in those systems of oppression, we have things that BIPOC, right, Black, Indigenous people of color, have been affected by, which include things like genocide of Indigenous people, slavery of Black African American people, right? Segregation. And I want us to know and remember that that has existed, and how has that evolved in looking differently throughout time, and how those have been causes as time has passed of what has caused riots, rebellions, resistance. So those are the systems of oppression.
All right, so specifically talking about the Watts riot, some of the causes. So the initial cause or the catalyst or the spark of the Watts riots is going to be some police brutality. So we know about police brutality. It was happening in 1965, it was happening in 1992, and it's still happening in 2021 as well. So this picture of this person we see to the bottom right of our screen is Marquette Fry. So he was about 21 years old, and late at one evening, people thought that he had been drinking and driving, so he got pulled over by the police. Originally, the interaction was pretty calm, and then his mom came out there. Somehow there was an escalation of the tensions with the police officers, and his mother, she had on her outfit really matters in this instance. So she had on a kind of open kind of dress or smock, and so one of the police officers grabbed her, and when they grabbed her, community members thought it was a pregnant woman who was being assaulted by the police. So word spread around the community that a pregnant woman had been assaulted by the police, and that was the initial spark. But the flames had really been building for a while, and we have lack of education or lack of funding for education. So even though California in 1965 has kind of moved away from those legal housing covenants, we still see this area or areas that are predominantly Black and brown, which means that those schools they go to are going to be Black and brown. And we're going to see this separate but equal kind of concept where it's supposed to be funded at the same rates as white schools, but we know that's not going to happen. We have housing segregation still, as I just talked about. So this redlining, this map you all see, this red area is going to be where most African Americans can live. And then it kind of spreads out depending on the color, depending on what race you are in Los Angeles. Another thing that LA has, which is really interesting, are these things called medical deserts. Now, I'm sure we've heard the term food deserts. That means that we don't have access to healthy grocery stores or food or things like that. Well, medical deserts are defined as an urban area that's going to be more than 5 miles from a hospital. So the inner city or around Watts was definitely more than 5 miles from a hospital. So all of these issues are going to be the root causes that lead to the Watts rebellion or the Watts riots happening in 1965. All right, so from there, we can see that when people aren't heard, they're going to definitely make their voices heard in some capacity.
Right. We have 3 years after the Watts riots, March 14, 1968, in a speech given at Grosse Pointe High School, 3 weeks before his assassination, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right, one of the namesakes of King Drew, says this. He says, "And I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And if it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and status quo than about justice and humanity." Let's take that quote in as we hear and understand riots as the language of the unheard. You can also listen to his speech titled "The Other America" on YouTube and watch it and learn from what he has to say about this. Again, 3 years after the Watts riots, rebellions.
And just a few weeks before he was assassinated as well. That is, whew. All right, so let's think about the community impact. So the community really rallied together after the Watts rebellions because they said, hey, we have all of these issues. What can we do to address some of these problems? So the first thing, we have the founding of Charles Junior University in 1966. So Charles Junior University is technically a historically Black college, an HBCU, which means it was founded for African Americans by African Americans and originally educated predominantly African American students. So that's going to be founded in 1966. So that's to address the inadequacies in education in the area. There were no secondary there was no secondary education in Watts in that area, excuse me. Then we also have the founding of Martin Luther King Jr. General Hospital in 1972. So this is going to be a 480-person hospital. So they have enough beds to really take care of the community. They're going to have a trauma center. They're going to have pediatrics. They're going to have prenatal. They're going to have so many different resources that had previously not been available in the Watts community. All right. And then also we have, why are we here? All right, the King Drew. So King Drew is going to take in his first students in 1982. So King Drew starts from Jordan High School, and it's going to start off in these 2 little bungalows, and it's actually going to be the planning for King Drew that was going to start in 1971. So the first students come in 11 years after the school originally starts to be planned. So we're going to have two original bungalows where all of the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade students end up going into the Martin Luther King Hospital and working there with the doctors and nurses, in really a really revolutionary program that was unheard of before this time period.
Mhm. So I hope that we remember a little bit about what we learned on Prop 13 and how, a lot of our homeschools have been defunded, right? A lot of our homeschools have not received the funding that they deserve. And so we had community members come together and say, hey, our students, our communities deserve to have funded education and resources. Of course, here at King Drew, we had doctors that came together and said we want a medical magnet high school, but we also had community members like Sweet Alice Harris, who was a community activist, an organizer, and a leader within a collective, a grassroots organization called Parents of Watts. They had a community barbecue. They got together, and essentially what came out of that community barbecue was the first enrollment of King Drew students, who then became those two bungalows, what then became the school that we have today, but all starting in 1971. We also wanted to touch upon the importance or what the uniform means to King Drew, right? And Ms. Moore White is laughing a little bit about the importance, and we're going to talk a little bit about fashion, right? But the black, white, bumblebee gold, obviously at King Drew we wear this uniform, but it started as a safety measure in our communities and also a visual representation within the community as we stepped out, right? Knowing where we were at on wearing, how our uniform stood us out and said, oh, that student is a King Drew student.
Yeah, I remember I definitely hated the bright yellow t-shirt. I definitely had only one of those. But whenever I wear it, people are like, oh, you go to King Drew? You must be smart. And I'd be like, you're right, maybe I am. Okay, I kind of like this. So I remember that association with the uniforms always being there in the community and around Los Angeles in general. All right, so we have another riot. So just because we have positive things happening in the community doesn't mean that some of the negatives that have been happening before are going to go away. So we have the LA riots or the LA rebellions that are going to start on April 29th and they're going to end on May 4th of 1994. So the original spark is going to take place on Normandy and Florence. That's a neighborhood or a cross street that some of you all know. And that's where some of that original tension really, really took off. So some of the causes. So now we have some slightly different causes, but some of them are also going to be the same. So Ms. Lopez, what about this first one?
Yeah, I mentioned to you all the systems of oppression, right? We talked about a little about racism and white supremacy. And white supremacy as a tool sometimes use this idea of putting our communities against each other, trying to divide our communities that are all oppressed by this system. And that includes the Asian community. And we've seen a lot of tensions built up. Well, the LA rebellions happened in 1992, but we saw something back in 1991 with the death of Latasha Harlins that was murdered in a store owned by a Korean family. We see that in Los Angeles during this time, a lot of Korean immigrant families came into buying stores, and a lot of them happened to be liquor stores, right? And so we knew what that meant within our communities to have liquor stores, and then the tensions that built because of, again, white supremacy as an institution creates spaces so that our communities are oppressed, right? And then we're all struggling and fighting for the little resources that exist. Well, we see that the Latasha Harlins death in 1991, and Ms. Moore White, maybe you could share a little bit more about what happens there.
All right, so Latasha Harlins is a 15-year-old African-American young lady. She's going to be over here to our left. And she goes into this into this liquor store. The liquor store is actually, it's been knocked down, but in its place on 94th and Florence, there's numero uno. So some of you may have actually been grocery shopping in the actual location where Latasha Harlins was killed. So she is going to get some orange juice. And some of you all know sometimes when you go into stores, sometimes we can be followed around or accused of stealing and things like that. So she had the money for the orange juice in her hands, and there was some kind of struggle that happened where she was accused of shoplifting. She got into a bit of a physical altercation with the store owner, and she ended up being shot. And when she ended up being shot, it was all recorded on video camera. When she ended up being shot, she actually had the $2 in her hand, the orange juice in the other hand, and it ended up really sparking some more tensions between Asian and Black families in inner city Los Angeles. And then on top of that, we have more police brutality. So we have the Rodney King beating and then the eventual acquittal of the officers who beat him. So on March 3rd of 1991, you guys can see down here to the bottom right, we're going to see Rodney King is going to be, okay, so somebody had a video camera. So this is before cell phones, before we have cameras built into our phones. And someone's going to have a camcorder with a tape, and they're going to happen to just be at the right place at the right time and catching the police, honestly, kind of for the first time on a national scale, being abusive to people. And so these 4 officers or 5 officers are going to end up being tried, and they're going to be acquitted. And so once they get acquitted, even though people have seen this assault that's happened with our own eyes, it's going to really spark more tensions between the police and the Black community. And then we're still dealing with lack of resources. So we have those food deserts I was talking about previously, where you have lack of access to quality or healthy food or grocery stores. You still have underfunded education, but now it's been legalized with Prop 13 that was passed in 1978, where property tax is tied to school funding. You still have inadequate healthcare in parts of inner city Los Angeles, and then you still have issues when it comes to affordable housing as well as quality housing. And then I'm not even done. We have another one. We have crack and mass incarceration are going to proliferate between the 1980s and the mid 1990s. So all of these things, and when I mean the crack era, so basically we're going to see communities being destroyed, Black men being taken out of families and being placed into jails. We're going to see so much happening where California's emphasis and the US emphasis becomes criminalizing people instead of helping them to overcome their addictions. So we have an interesting stat here too. So Ms. Lopez?
Yeah. Yeah, so we have mass incarceration taking almost a whole generation of people in the 80s. We see that in California, right? We want to ask and question, what have been the priorities? What do we fund? And in 1980, and by we, I mean the California government, in the 1980s, California built 22 prisons. 1980s, 20 new prisons. In the same time period, only one public university was built. So this argument that we don't have money to fund our schools is an incorrect argument, because there is money out there if we are funding mass incarceration, if we are funding the building of 22 prisons. That one university that was built was UC Merced. And we may have heard of many prisons out in places like Palmdale, like Delano, right? That have been built over the last few years because of this push for mass incarceration, specifically of the Black African American community.
All right, and if you look to the bottom left, we have this graph, and you can see the prison growth from 1950 through 2016. And so we can see prison growth is pretty constant from 1950 all the way until about 1980. And then something happens, where we have this boom of our prison system from 1980 to the present day. So I don't think that people became more violent or became eviler. I think there was a system that kind of shifted where we could say, hey, we can get free labor if we're able to criminalize and incarcerate large groups of people. All right, and so here we're gonna talk about some more growth. So once again, we have negative and then we have growth coming. So we're gonna look at the growth that happens for us as a school for King Drew. So we're gonna grow from our, growing into King Drew. So from bungalows to 4 acres. So there's this phrase, 40 acres and a mule. That was what African Americans were supposed to get at the end of slavery. Well, we didn't get that, but hey, King Drew got our 4 acres, and we see how that's changed so many lives. So let's talk about this. So Katie, as I said previously, started off as 2 bungalows, just 2 bungalows on the corner or right behind King Drew, where it is currently on 118th and Compton Boulevard. In 1996, the construction is going to start on our current school building. And so we're going to see this wonderful, beautiful structure that we know on the corner of 120th and Compton.
So yeah, so we see that coming out of this, we have the Black architects, Black sculpturists, and predominantly Black community members that come in to support and build this school. This school is intentionally built by community with community and for community. And the purpose of us sharing this is, especially me now, right, as Ms. Moore White and I, we often talk to our students to continue advocating for themselves. And really, our students are what make King Drew. And you all can come in and say, this is my school, this is what we believe we need, this is what we want in our community. So sharing with you that King Drew was built by community, with community, and for community. And that includes current King Drew youth.
All right, and so that Black architect is going to be Fred Williams. So Fred Williams is going to design the school, and then we're going to see Mark Graham is going to be the head architect or the head person on the team, and then we're going to see that Fred Williams is also going to design this 3-foot concrete relief that we have on the outside of the school, and it's going to be created or brought to life by Tina Allen, which is going to be our artist down here. So we see all of this intentionality. So it's like as Ms. Lopez said, it was originally, by a Black architect, a Black community for Black students, and honestly for all students. But the emphasis was heavily on the Black community because during that time period, Watts was predominantly African-American. And so let's think about the geographic location between Charleston University and Martin Luther King Hospital. So we have Martin Luther King Hospital across the street. So we have that medicine focus, and where we can see that that students can actually become doctors and treat their communities and stay in their communities. And then we have CDU on the opposite across the street, where students can get their education in their community and stay where they are and continue to help their community. And then we make that nice beat of King Drew on the corner of 120th and Compton. And so when we think about the intentionality of the building, it's not just on the outside, it's on the inside too. So that emphasis on science, we have 21 science classrooms. And in those 21 science classrooms, we have biology, chemistry, physics, physiology, AP chemistry, marine biology, and so many other things to really expose our students to science they might maybe not have access to in other high schools in the area. And then that medicine and science focus, we try to emphasize these things in our classrooms, in our teachings, and all around so that we can have an infused culture and infused theme of medicine and science throughout our school. All right, and Ms. Lopez?
Yeah, this is where I take us into the next part, right, of our community that has come back, our community that is here. Miss Moore White and I often share our stories about being King Drew students, about being here and what that meant to us. We also want to share from other community members. We have Miss Turner up here in the top left corner. And this is a quote, we reached out, and this is a quote that Miss Turner shared with us. She is class of 1989 and a current math and choir teacher. And Miss Turner said, teachers like Mr. Ramsey, Mr. Siegel, Ms. Washington, and Dr. Ernie Roy, to name a few, who challenged the shy kid to go above and beyond, to not settle for being average, to not give up when events in life were weighing on me. My senior year, I had a major family issues that I was dealing with, and I began to give up on school. My grades plummeted. Adults would not let me. I did not end my senior year the way I wanted to academically, but I was able to stay in the top 10 of the class. Then down here, you'll see that we also asked them, what does it mean to come back and teach and work at King Drew? And you'll be able to read a little bit more of their story as you get access to this PowerPoint.
All right, and then we have Carmen Gaitán, or known as Casty. All right, Miss Castro, she's going to be class of 1996. She is a math teacher that many of us know and love. So she says, I love the sense of belonging and support King Drew gave me and my family. 3 other siblings graduated from KD, class of 1998, 2000, 2002. All of us college graduates, 3 with masters, 3 are teachers. I want to do for other students what King Drew did for me and my family. It made us realize college is for us and our goals are or were attainable no matter our background. And then you also see what Cassie says about coming back and working in the community as well.
We also have Miss Paredes, Miss Luz Paredes, class of 2004, our senior office tech. Whenever you walk maybe into the attendance office or the main office, she's one of the first people that you see there. And she said, I came back to King Drew for the familiarity of the school and staff. King Drew's a gem in this city, and it fulfills to see that this school can provides many opportunities and cares about our youth.
All right, and the last person is my brother from another mother, Mr. Sankara. So Brandon Sankara, class of 2007, who is now back as a substitute, as a math teacher. He says, there was always an inclination in me to come back to KD after I graduated, because that's what alumni before me, like Jarvis Givens and David Hampton, did. I remember them coming to Mr. Ramsey's class after they graduated in '06 and saying to myself, oh, this is what we're supposed to do? Okay, cool. And then he goes on to talk about how King Drew really emphasized his love of community development and community support. And even now, Brandon and myself are a part of a group called Wisdom from the Field, which does a lot of community outreach. All right, so let's go. Go ahead.
Yeah, all of this comes to wrap up this conversation in this lecture about how do we preserve our communities. There are many ways that we can preserve our communities wherever you want to get involved and however you want to do it. This will lead us to our next lecture, which is we'll be talking about our last lecture, I believe, Ms. Moore White, on resiliency.
Yes, so coming up on May 14th, resiliency. So one thing about our communities, we definitely talked about some of the traumas and the issues and the suffering that we've been through, but for whatever reason, we can always find the joy. We can always find the happiness. We can always find that resiliency zone. So we're going to talk about those things in our community that make us resilient, those people who have come back to our communities. And we just kind of gave ourselves a little bit of a start with our King Drew family, and we're going to continue on with that on May 14th. So we hope you all will join us at the same time on May 14th at 9 a.m. And check us out. So thank you all, everyone, for joining us this time.